The sky was burning in shades of red and orange as the battlefield stretched endlessly before Daniel, and every breath he took was filled with smoke and the sharp scent of scorched metal, while the ground shook under the thunder of distant explosions, and the air trembled with the whine of plasma fire. He moved quickly over cracked pavement, keeping his head low as pieces of shattered walls collapsed around him. His mission was simple in the beginning: retrieve the injured allies trapped near the western sector and return before nightfall. But nothing in war stayed simple for long, and the chaos here was worse than anything he had seen in months of deployment. The comms in his helmet crackled with broken voices calling out positions, but the signal was weak. The interference from enemy jammers had turned the network into nothing but static. Daniel scanned the street ahead, spotting smoke pouring from the ruins of a tall alien building. The architecture was strange to him, all flowing curves and bright colors now dulled by ash and fire. As he passed the collapsed entry, a faint sound reached his ears. It was not the deep rumble of battle, or the sharp hiss of energy fire. It was higher, softer, almost lost in the chaos. It was the sound of someone crying. He froze and listened, straining to hear over the roar of destruction. There it was again, a thin whimper buried under the groan of bending steel. His orders told him to keep moving toward the rendezvous point, but his instincts urged him toward the noise. The sound was close, coming from beneath a tangle of debris that had once been the building's lower floor. He stepped inside the ruined structure, careful of the unstable ground. Every step echoed in the half-collapsed chamber, and shafts of dusty light cut through the smoke, highlighting twisted beams and shards of alien glass. When he reached the source of the sound, his chest tightened. Beneath a heavy metal support beam lay a small alien child. Her skin shimmered faintly as if dusted with silver, and her eyes were wide with fear, staring up at him without recognition. She looked no older than 7. By human measure, her thin arms were pinned beneath the wreckage, and her legs trembled as she struggled weakly. Daniel knelt beside her, speaking softly, though he knew she could not understand his words. The tone alone seemed to make her pause in her crying, and she blinked at him as though trying to decide if he was danger or safety. He examined the beam. It was too heavy to move without leverage, but the building was groaning under its own weight, and every second spent here risked bringing the whole place down. Still leaving her here was not an option. He unclipped a folding tool from his belt, wedged it under the beam, and pushed with all his strength. His muscles screamed, and the beam shifted slightly, just enough for the girl to free her arms. She whimpered in pain and clung to him as he lifted the weight a little more to free her legs. Finally, she was free, and he pulled her close, wrapping his jacket around her small frame. She was shaking both from cold and fear, and the strange glow of her skin pulsed faintly against his chest. He could hear distant footsteps now, not the uneven tread of a civilian, but the steady march of enemy patrols, sweeping the ruins for survivors. If they found her, there would be no mercy. Daniel moved quickly, slipping through the nearest gap in the wall and crouching low behind a pile of broken masonry. The girl pressed her face into his shoulder as the patrol passed, their voices speaking in a harsh alien tongue. Daniel waited until the sound faded before rising again. The route to the extraction point was now cut off, and his comms were still dead. There was only one option left: take her across the battlefield himself, and hope to reach friendly lines before the fighting closed in completely. He adjusted his grip on her, and she held onto him tightly, as if sensing his intention. He could feel how light she was, almost weightless in his arms, and he wondered how she had survived this long alone. Her clothes were torn and singed at the edges, and her breathing was shallow, yet she made no sound now, only watching him with those strange, bright eyes. He took one last look at the burning building they had escaped, and then began moving toward the eastern streets, where cover was better and enemy presence lighter. The city around him was nothing but a graveyard of stone and steel towers that had once touched the clouds, now lay in twisted heaps. Whole avenues were blocked by the carcasses of armored vehicles and scorch marks painted every wall. He stepped over shattered alien pottery and scorched banners that once hung with pride. In this district, the girl's small hand clung to the collar of his jacket, as if afraid he might vanish into the smoke without her. He spoke to her in quiet tones, trying to keep her calm, though neither understood the words. The meaning was in the steady rhythm of his voice, and the way he held her close against the cold wind somewhere. In the distance, another explosion tore through the air, shaking the ground beneath his boots. The fight was moving closer, and the sky was streaked with the trails of missiles and burning debris. He knew he had little time. If he could reach the old market district, he might find a path through the alleys that would lead them towards safer ground. It would be longer but safer, and with the girl in his arms, speed mattered less than keeping her out of sight. The thought of leaving her never crossed his mind, even though every instinct as a soldier told him to avoid unnecessary risk here in the ruins, carrying this fragile life through the Inferno. He felt the weight of every choice he had made, and everyone yet to come. Daniel kept moving through the ruined streets with the girl held close against his chest, the heat from nearby fires mixing with the cold wind that swept through the gaps. In the shattered buildings, his boots crunched over broken stone and twisted scraps of alien metal as he searched for a safe path ahead. The sounds of war were everywhere, the low roar of distant engines, the sharp crack of weapons fire, and the occasional scream that was quickly swallowed by the chaos, each sound pressed against his nerves, reminding him that every step could be his last and hers as well. He tried his come again, tapping the side of his helmet, but all he got was a whisper of static. The enemy jamming was still strong, and it meant he had no way to call for backup or warn his squad of where he was going alone through enemy territory was dangerous enough, but carrying a child who could not run or defend herself made every moment 10 times harder. Still, he tightened his grip on her, feeling her small heartbeat against his armor. She was light enough to carry, but not light enough to forget that he was already tired from hours of fighting earlier in the day. The street ahead opened into what had once been a wide square, and Daniel froze in place. The center of the square was littered with the wreckage of alien vehicles, their hulls blackened and smoking. Several enemy soldiers were moving among them, scanning the ruins for survivors. He ducked into the shadow of a fallen pillar, pressing his back against the cold stone. The girl stayed quiet, her breath warm against his neck, and he felt a flicker of relief that she seemed to understand the need for silence. He waited for the patrol to move away, but they were thorough, checking every wreck and scanning every shadow. If he stayed here too long, another group might come from behind, trapping them completely. He spotted a narrow side street to his left, half blocked by rubble, but just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was a risk, but better than waiting for discovery. He shifted the girl in his arms and slipped quietly into the side street, keeping low and moving quickly. The alley was dark and smelled of smoke and burned food scraps that must have been left behind in the rush to flee. There were signs that people had once lived here. Bright scraps of fabric still clinging to clotheslines above, and a toppled market stall spilling alien fruit that had long since rotted. Flies buzzed in the air, and Daniel kept his eyes ahead, stepping over the remains of what had been a home. The girl glanced around with wide eyes as if remembering something, but she stayed silent, perhaps knowing that speaking now could be dangerous. Halfway through the alley, a sudden crash behind them made Daniel spin around. A piece of wall had fallen from one of the damaged buildings, and the noise was loud enough to carry down the street. He could already hear the shouts of enemy soldiers reacting to the sound. He pushed forward faster, his muscles burning, as he forced his way over piles of debris. At the end of the alley, the way was blocked by a section of collapsed roof, but there was just enough space at the bottom to crawl through. He set the girl down gently and pointed for her to go first. She hesitated only for a moment, then slipped into the gap. Daniel followed, sliding through on his elbows and knees until they emerged into another street. This one was quieter at first glance, no soldiers in sight, only the distant flash of weapons fire far to the west. Daniel took a moment to breathe, scanning for the next place to hide. The buildings here were older, with thick stone walls that had survived most of the bombardment. They could use them as cover if they moved carefully. He picked the girl up again and headed toward a half-standing shop, its door hanging loose on broken hinges. Inside it was dark and cool, the air heavy with dust. Shelves were overturned and the floor was scattered with shattered glass, but it offered a moment of safety. Daniel knelt and checked the girl's leg. The injury from the beam earlier had left a deep bruise and a small cut that was still bleeding slowly. He pulled out the medkit from his pack, cleaning the wound as gently as he could. She winced but did not cry. Instead, she watched him with an expression he could not quite read, half fear, half curiosity. When he finished wrapping the wound, she touched the bandage lightly, as if testing it, then gave the smallest nod. It was the first sign she trusted him beyond instinct, and it gave him a spark of determination. To see this through, they could not stay here long. The longer they paused, the more likely it was that enemy patrols would find this part of the city. He listened carefully for any sounds outside, then moved toward the back door of the shop beyond. A narrow passage led between two buildings into an area where the walls were close enough to hide them from aerial drones. The girl kept glancing upward as they moved, her strange shimmering skin catching the light in quick flashes. Daniel wondered if she could sense things he could not, perhaps the hum of enemy technology or the approach of danger before it arrived. Whatever it was, he began to trust her glances as much as his own instincts. The passage ended at the edge of what had once been an open marketplace. Now it was a maze of overturned stalls, broken carts, and charred fabric that fluttered weakly in the wind. The smell of smoke here was stronger, mixed with something metallic and bitter that clung to the back of his throat. They would have to cross it to reach the network of alleys on the other side, which could lead them toward the old eastern checkpoint. If they could make it there, they might find friendlies, or at least a clearer route to safety. He crouched low, moving from stall to stall, using the wreckage as cover. The girl clung to him, her eyes darting at every sound. A distant crack made him pause, and he realized it was sniper fire somewhere above. The shots were not aimed at them yet, but he knew that one wrong move could change that. He kept moving slowly, his eyes scanning for the glint of a scope or the shadow of a soldier above. A section of collapsed roof offered better cover ahead, and he headed for it, slipping inside just as another shot rang out, striking the ground where they had been a moment earlier. The girl gripped his jacket tightly, her breath quick and uneven. He could feel her fear, but also the stubborn will that kept her silent. This child had survived alone in this burning city until he found her, and now he understood she was not as helpless as she looked. She had the strength to endure, and he had the strength to protect her. Together they might make it through the inferno that lay between them and safety. Daniel stayed under the collapsed roof for a few breaths, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light and his ears search for any sign that the sniper had found their position. The girl was pressed against him, her small frame trembling slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on the open gaps above, as if she could see more than he could. He waited until the next distant shot rang out in another direction before deciding to move again. The marketplace ahead was a maze, but if they crossed it carefully, they could reach the alleys beyond, which would lead them toward the eastern side of the city, where friendly forces might still hold ground. He crouched low, stepping quietly over splintered wood and torn cloth, his boots barely making a sound on the dust-covered ground. The girl kept her face against his shoulder, her arms tight around his neck. Daniel moved from one ruined stall to the next, pausing in the shadows when the sound of distant engines drew closer. The noise grew louder until the shadow of a drone passed over them, gliding slowly above the market. Its sensor lights swept the wreckage, searching for movement. Daniel froze in place, holding his breath until the beam of light passed over the collapsed roof and moved on when it was gone. He pushed forward again, weaving through the remains of the once bustling market near the center of the square. He spotted a destroyed medical transport, its hull charred and cracked open as if torn Apart by a blast, Daniel approached cautiously, scanning for movement before stepping inside. The interior smelled of burned plastic and antiseptic. He searched quickly, finding a half-intact medkit and several packets of water. He gave the girl a drink, watching her take small, careful sips as if she had learned to ration what little she had. The water seemed to calm her, and she touched his hand briefly in what felt like a quiet thank you, though she still did not speak. They left the transport and moved toward the far side of the market. The wind carried the faint sound of alien voices somewhere ahead, and Daniel ducked into the cover of a toppled stall. He listened closely, trying to judge distance. The voices were moving slowly, sweeping the area in a search pattern. He needed to move before they closed in. He turned to the girl, about to pick her up again, when she suddenly raised her small hand and pointed toward a narrow alley to their right. Her eyes locked on his, and then shifted back to the alley almost urgently. Daniel hesitated, but the intensity in her gaze made him trust her instinct. Without a word, he moved toward the path she indicated. Alley was choked with rubble, forcing him to climb over chunks of stone and twisted metal. At one point, he had to set her down and help her crawl through a gap between two walls. She moved quickly for her size, showing a surprising amount of balance and awareness. Daniel followed close behind, emerging into a small courtyard on the other side. As soon as they stepped out, a deafening roar split the air, and a plasma blast struck the exact spot in the market where they had been seconds before. The force of the explosion sent dust and heat rolling into the courtyard. Daniel realized that if he had ignored her, they would both have been vaporized. He looked at the girl, her glowing skin flickering faintly in the dim light, and understood that her senses were beyond human. She could feel danger coming in ways he could not explain. He gave her a short nod of acknowledgement, and she stared back for a moment before glancing toward the far end of the courtyard, where another street began. Daniel took the lead again, now more certain than ever that she was not just a helpless child, but someone who might be the key to both their survival. The new street was lined with taller buildings, their upper levels still intact, though scarred by the battle. Windows hung open, with fabric flapping weakly in the wind, and somewhere above a faint creaking echoed through the air. Daniel moved quickly but carefully, keeping close to the walls to avoid open sight lines. The girl stayed alert in his arms, her head turning toward sounds he had not yet noticed. At one point, she pressed her hand to his chest, making him stop a moment later. A pair of enemy soldiers crossed the intersection ahead, moving fast toward the market. Daniel waited until they were gone before continuing, grateful for her warning. As they approached the end of the street, another problem appeared. A section of the road had collapsed into a crater too wide to jump and too deep to climb down and back up with her in his arms. The only way across was a narrow beam from the remains of a walkway above. Daniel tested it with one boot, feeling it shift slightly under his weight. The fall would be deadly, but staying here was worse. He adjusted his grip on the girl, holding her tightly, and began to cross each step, slow and deliberate. The beam groaned but held until he was halfway across, when a sudden burst of gunfire cracked through the air from somewhere behind. He moved faster, ignoring the burn in his legs and the sharp bite of fear in his chest. They made it across just as more shots hit the beam, shattering part of it into the crater below. Daniel ducked into the cover of a nearby doorway, catching his breath. The girl looked up at him with wide eyes, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other, both aware of how close they had been. He tightened his grip and pushed on, knowing there would be no second chances in this place. Every sound of battle around them was a reminder that the city was still very much alive with danger, and that the line between life and death here was as thin as the beam. They had just crossed the alleys ahead, would take them toward the old city walls, and if the map in his head was right, there might still be a route to the eastern checkpoint from there. It would be a long walk through areas where he had no idea who held control, but with her by his side and her strange sense of danger, he felt a spark of hope that they could make it. If they survived the next stretch of streets, They might see friendly lines again, and maybe, just maybe, this child's survival could mean something greater than they. Two of them alone. The air grew heavier as Daniel pushed through the narrow lanes toward the old city walls. The sound of battle was closer, now, not the distant rumble he had grown used to, but the sharp, cutting whine of plasma fire echoing between. The stone building's smoke curled in long streams above the rooftops, mixing with the faint glow of fires that had been burning for hours. The girl in his arms was silent, yet her eyes kept scanning the shadows as if reading the hidden threats within. Daniel felt the ache in his arms and legs, but he did not slow, knowing every second spent here was another chance for the enemy to close in when they reached the last bend before the wall. Daniel slowed enough to peer around the corner. The street ahead was open and dangerous, only a few scattered carts and debris offering cover. Beyond it, the base of the old wall rose high into the smoky air, and at the far end of the road, a checkpoint shimmered faintly with the green glow of friendly shielding. They were close, painfully close, but between them and that gate stood a patrol of 6 enemy soldiers, armed and alert. The only way through was to fight or create a distraction, and both options came with deadly risk. Daniel set the girl down behind a half-collapsed doorway and crouched in front of her. He held a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the gate, trying to make her understand that she needed to stay hidden until he came for her. She nodded slowly, her hands clutching the edge of his jacket as if unwilling to let go. For a moment he hesitated, then placed one hand gently on her shoulder before stepping away into the street. His pulse hammered in his ears as he moved from one piece of cover to the next, pulling a grenade from his belt. He waited until the patrol was at its farthest point from him, then rolled the grenade into the wreckage near their position. The explosion tore through the street with a flash of light and a rush of heat, sending the soldiers scrambling for cover. Daniel used the chaos to move forward, firing in short bursts to force them back. He aimed not to kill all of them, but to keep them pinned long enough to grab the girl and run. Yet as he turned back toward her hiding place, his stomach twisted. 2 of the soldiers had broken away from the fight and were moving toward the doorway where she was hidden. Daniel sprinted, his breath tearing at his lungs. His rifle barked again, dropping one of the soldiers. Before he could reach her, the other turned on him, firing wildly. Daniel felt the impact as a shot struck his armor, the force nearly knocking him off his feet. He closed the distance and drove the enemy back with a burst of close fire, then scooped the girl into his arms. She clung to him with desperate strength, her small frame pressed tight against his chest. The remaining soldiers were regrouping, and now the path to the gate was even more dangerous. Enemy fire raked the street, sending chips of stone flying as Daniel ducked behind a broken wall. He checked his ammo, grimacing at the near-empty magazine. He had one more grenade left, and no choice but to use it. He pulled the pin and hurled it toward the enemy position, then dashed into the smoke it created. The girl buried her face in his shoulder as they ran, his boots pounding over cracked stone and scattered debris. They were only meters from the checkpoint when another burst of fire slammed into the wall beside them, showering them in dust. Daniel kept moving, feeling his strength beginning to fade. The weight of the girl was nothing compared to the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. Every breath felt like it might be his last, yet he refused to stop with the enemy closing in. He angled toward the final stretch of road, the green shimmer of the shield, now so close he could almost feel its hum in the air. A final obstacle appeared in the form of a heavy mounted weapon on the far side of the street, its barrel already turning toward them. Daniel shifted the girl to one arm and reached for his last smoke canister, yanking the pin with his teeth and tossing it forward. The thick gray cloud billowed, instantly masking them from view. He pushed through the haze, blind but driven by the memory of how he had found her trapped and alone. He could not let that be her fate again, not when they were this close. Shots ripped through the smoke, and one grazed his side, sending a sharp burst of pain through his body. He stumbled, but did not fall, clutching the girl tighter. She looked up at him, her strange eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, and for a moment, It felt as though she was lending him some part of her strength. Daniel's vision blurred, but he kept moving, focusing only on the green shimmer ahead. The noise of the battlefield faded into the background, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. They broke through the last line of smoke, just as friendly soldiers rushed forward from the gate. Medics and guards shouted orders, covering them with return fire. Daniel collapsed to his knees inside the safety perimeter, gasping for breath as strong hands pulled the girl from his arms. She resisted at first, reaching back toward him, until a medic knelt to reassure her. He could barely hear their voices over the ringing in his ears, but the sight of her safe within the protective barrier eased the tension in his chest. Daniel tried to rise, but the pain in his side pulled him down again. Medics were already working on him, patching the wound and checking for other injuries. The girl stood a short distance away, her bright eyes fixed on him, even as others guided her toward shelter. There was no fear in her gaze now, only something deeper, something like gratitude, and Daniel realized that whatever happened next, this moment would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. The battle outside the shield raged on, but within its glow, there was a fragile sense of safety, a fragile chance for survival, and perhaps even for hope. The sounds of the battle outside the shield were still loud, but muffled now, as if the barrier itself was holding back not just weapons fire, but the weight of the war. Daniel lay on a stretcher near the field station, his armor stripped away and his side wrapped in fresh bandages. He felt the ache deep in his muscles and the dull throb where the enemy round had grazed him, yet his mind was not on his own wounds. His eyes kept moving, searching for the small figure he had carried through the burning streets. Finally saw her near a cluster of medics who were checking her vitals and cleaning the dust from her hair. The girl sat quietly, her glowing skin dim under the soft lights of the station, but her posture was steady and alert. She glanced around, often watching the shield, as if she could still feel the danger beyond it. Every so often her gaze would flick toward Daniel and hold there for a few heartbeats before returning to the world around her. It was not the look of someone in fear, but of someone making sure a promise had been kept. A commander approached Daniel's stretcher, a broad figure in reinforced armor with lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He asked for a brief account of what had happened, and Daniel gave it in simple words, explaining how he had found her under the beam, how the Cums had been dead, how he had carried her through enemy territory without knowing if they would make it. The commander listened without interruption, then nodded once, saying that the child was more important than Daniel could yet understand. She was from one of the last surviving families of a neutral alien faction, whose voice in the conflict had been silenced. When the city was attacked, her safe return could change the political balance, perhaps even open the door to peace talks. Daniel absorbed the words in silence, thinking of how small she had felt in his arms, and how easily she might have been lost if he had made any different choice. He did not know what peace talks would come, or what power her survival truly held. But he knew one thing clearly: if there was even a chance that saving her could stop more cities from burning, then every risk he had taken was worth it. The medics moved him to a recovery tent where the air was warmer, and the noise of battle seemed further away. He lay back against the thin cot, listening to the soft hum of the generators outside. His thoughts drifted to the streets they had crossed together, to the way she had pointed toward danger before it struck, to the way she had clung to him even when he was bleeding and barely able to stand. The memory was sharp and real, like the heat of the fires they had escaped, yet it carried with it a strange calm. He had not been fighting for orders out there, not for strategy or territory, but for her, for one small life in a world tearing itself apart. A shadow fell across the entrance of the tent, and when he looked up, she was there, escorted by one of the medics. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes searching the dim space until they found him. Without hesitation, she crossed the short distance to his cot and stood beside him. Her hands were small and careful. As she touched the edge of his blanket, almost as if asking permission, Daniel shifted slightly and gave a faint smile, letting her know it was all right. She reached up and placed her palm against his cheek, her skin cool and smooth with that faint shimmer still visible in the light. There were no words exchanged, yet the silence felt full, as if something important had been spoken without sound. Her gaze held his for a long moment, before she lowered her hand and took a small step back. The medic gave a polite nod and led her away again. Daniel watched her go, feeling the space she left behind, more than the pain in his side. Next day, the orders came down that a diplomatic envoy would be arriving to escort her to safety, far from the front lines. The plan was for her to be reunited with her surviving kin in a protected zone where negotiations could begin. Daniel was not part of the escort detail, his injuries keeping him grounded, but he stood near the shield gate as they prepared to leave. She saw him from across the courtyard, and without hesitation, she broke from the group, running to him. The guards tensed but relaxed when they saw her stop just a step away from him. She held out a small object, something that looked like a pendant made of crystal and metal, unlike anything he had seen before. She placed it in his hand and closed his fingers around it. Daniel looked at the pendant, feeling the weight of it, not just in his palm but in what it meant. She gave him one last look, her bright eyes steady and unblinking, then turned and walked back to the envoy. He stood there watching until the green shimmer of the shield opened to let them pass and closed again behind them, sealing the war away from her for now. That night, Daniel sat alone in the quiet of the tent, turning the pendant over in his hand. Its surface caught the faint light in shifting colors, and he wondered if it was a token of thanks or something more, a promise perhaps that their paths might cross again in a world no longer burning. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket before lying back, his body still aching but his mind strangely at peace. In the days that followed, he heard news that the envoy had reached safety, and that talks had begun between factions that had not spoken in years. There were no promises yet, no signed treaties, only the faint possibility that the war might slow. But even that was more than there had been before. Every time he thought of the city and the streets they had crossed, he remembered her hand on his cheek and the unspoken trust between them. In a place where death was constant and hope rare, that memory felt like a shield stronger than any barrier of energy or wall of stone. Daniel knew the war was far from over, and that he would return to the fight once he healed, but he also knew that somewhere beyond the lines, a child he had carried through fire was alive and safe, and that her survival might be the first spark in the long dark. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the camp fade around him, holding on to that thought as tightly as she had once held on to him. And in that quiet, he understood that even in the heart of war, one act of compassion could change everything. The end.